Hi, welcome to session 2 of the sixth topic of the semester, Texas in the midst of civil wars all the way to Reconstruction from 1860 to 1877. So in this topic, we're examining Texas history in the time of the U.S. Civil War. And of course, Texas is going to participate in the U.S. Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, the Southern Confederacy, that seceded from the Union after the election of Lincoln, something that we're actually going to cover here in this particular session, session 2. So we're going to look at the causes of the Civil War. We're going to continue looking at the causes, something that we started in session 1, looking at the divisions of the United States, the sectional divisions between a commercial, industrial North and an agricultural South that devoted most of the activities, most of the economic activities for the growth for the planting and growth of cash crops like tobacco, rice, and of course cotton. Again, cotton is going to be the main staple of the South when the North industrialized. We cover that in session 1. So we were looking at those sectional divisions, how the North and the South became divided, going back all the way to the beginning of the United States in the colonial period. So those divisions are historical. Those divisions did not just happen years or decades before the Civil War occurred. The divisions in the United States started out ever since the beginning of the country. So we cover that quite fully. There were different settlement patterns in the North, religious communities, Puritan Quakers arriving to the upper colonies, and of course, English settlers arriving to the South, mainly, again, planters that were to develop plantations to grow things like tobacco, rice, and of course, cotton as well. So again, those are historical divisions. Those sectional divisions are historical, and they intensified when the United States becomes independent. We see the formation of the United States. The 13 colonies become now 13 states united under a national government. And still, we're going to see the continuity of those divisions between commercial North, where slavery just did not really take root in a significant way, the way it actually took root in the South. Again, in the South, because we see plantations, because we see cash crop agriculture, of course, we see the introduction of the system of labor very early on, back in the colonial period, slavery. And this is something that will continue, will persist into the national period as well. The South will hold on to this institution, to this system of labor, precisely because in the national period, as I explained, the North is industrializing. There's an industrial revolution that require cotton, for textile manufacturing. There's textile industries in the North that requires cotton. There's also, of course, England. This is the leading industrial power, of course, in the world that also requires cotton. And there was a great market for it. There was a great demand that the U.S. South is going to supply. So instead of industrializing, they're simply going to expand their plantation system across the West, and they're going to actually integrate more and more territories and more states that will join the Union. But those states were agricultural states, which introduced the system of slavery as the dominant system of labor that was used to grow the cash crops, in this case, cotton. So the entire South becomes now an economy totally geared towards cotton production and cotton exports. The entire South, that is to say, cotton king, when cotton becomes king. So again, those are sectional divisions we're examining in session 1. That by the 1830s, this is already causing debate, national debate between, the North and the South as to what is the best system for the country, what will be the best economic system for the nation. Is it going to be industrial capitalism with a system of wage labor, the way, again, Northerners were organized? Or is it going to be agriculture with a system of slavery that is going to be the more productive, the most profitable, the most dominant? Which is going to actually be the dominant, in other words, system. Again, so we examine all those debates. There were issues dealing with consumption, with job creation. We examine all of that at the end of session one, how the North and the South are actually dividing, again, over which economic system will be better for the growth of the national economy. All right. So it is at this juncture that I would like to now shift our attention to our lecture outlines and now proceed to look at other series of factors that also were involved in pushing those two sections further and further apart. There's going to be a breaking point actually in 1860. So sectionalism was one. We explained all of that again very thoroughly. Sectionalism. So there's a second reason again why the Civil War occurred, and that is that around the 1830s and moving into the 1840s and beyond, there was now a growing abolitionist movement taking place in the United States, most strongly and more pervasively in the northern part of the country. Again, the abolitionist movement. So the abolitionist movement, of course, is a movement, is a popular movement in which organizations, individuals, etc., are petitioning Congress a reform, an amendment to end slavery in the Constitution. That's what is the abolitionist movement, to make it illegal, that is to say, to do away with slavery, to abolish slavery in the Constitution. That's what the abolitionist movement was. And again, so there were abolitionists, of course, prior to the 1830 in the United States, but those were just a handful of individuals, if you will, in many of the northern states, particularly Pennsylvania. There were abolitionist societies there, of course, and there were also abolitionist thinkers in New England and the like, New York. The North particularly was, pretty much already thinking about the possibility of abolishing slavery. But by the 1830s, this is going to become a massive political movement, not just, a restricted, if you will, phenomenon to certain localities, certain regions of the country, but rather a very pervasive, widespread popular movement, again, that found support among many, many different social groups in the North, that they all believed, they all agreed that it was necessary to abolish slavery. But in this case, the abolitionist movement was not necessarily using economics as a reason why we need to abolish slavery, why this is not viable, in other words, why slavery is not really, making the economy grow because it's taking away jobs, etc. No, the abolitionist movement is going to derive its ideological basis for rejecting slavery on religion. Okay, not economics, but the abolitionists, for the most part, use religion. They use Christianity. They use the Bible to support their arguments against slavery. Okay, and why is it so? Because in the 1830s and 40s, there was a religious revival taking place in the United States called the Second Great Awakening. And it is out of this religious revival that we're going to see the rise of the abolitionists. In other words, that many of the revivalists, again, there were Puritans, there were Quakers, there were evangelicals, and so on. There's so many different groups, Shakers. There's so many different denominations, Christian denominations, that were involved in this revival movement. Out of that revivalist movement, we're going to see that many of the people that were involved in this activism, in this religious activism, turned to the abolitionist cause. In other words, they endorse the cause of the abolitionists because they saw that, again, this was the Christian thing to do, in other words. Now, the Second Great Awakening, again, is a religious revival that it was very unique in U.S. history, in that the participants of the Great Awakening believed that that the second coming of Christ was imminent. In other words, this was a prophetic movement. The Second Great Awakening was more of a prophetic movement in which people were convinced that Christ was about to return to earth anytime soon. It was just around the corner. So therefore, the abolitionists believed that it was totally necessary to heal society and to attend the needs, the ills of society. For example, alcoholism. Try to build schools for people to, become educated and go and spread Christianity in the frontier to convert the Native Americans, for example. And prostitution, in other words, there were so many ills, of course, but one of the greatest ills that the revivalists identified that was plaguing the country and that was affecting the ability of the United States to transform into a true Christian society was slavery. In other words, that slavery is preventing the United States from being truly Christian, and therefore we're not going to be ready for the second coming of Christ. So if Christ returns to earth, this nation is not going to be prepared because we're still practicing this. We're still practicing, enslaving other human beings. So this is a sin, in other words. So again, this is a moral wrong. This is a sin. This is against Christ's teachings and so on. So there's going to be a religious basis for rejecting slavery, again, from the revivalists, and many of them became abolitionists. They were, of course, engaged in their church activity during the revival, of course, but at the same time, they were trying to end slavery by forming associations, forming clubs, forming communities, abolitionist communities that were writing letters to members of Congress, and in such a massive scale. Again, they're going to be flooding Congress with so many letters, petitioning Congress to end slavery. And one of the greatest abolitionists was actually William Lloyd Garrison from Massachusetts. He actually had a newspaper, The Liberator, which he was using the newspaper, again, to publish anti-slavery articles across not only in Massachusetts, but across New England. And many of his ideas were widely read in the North, outside of New England as well. So he had a great impact, really, in mobilizing the entire population of the North, towards this cause, to endorse this cause. That is to say, he was deeply religious. He has a Puritan background, and he used religion constantly, again, to attack slavery. Okay, so now again, the North is further and further, more and more resolved to oppose slavery. Okay, and now it's not just about economics; it's also about morality. It's also about religion as well. So religion is going to be also a force that is going to, endorse this cause of abolitionism. But this is also going to rupture, again, the country, because the South felt that the North, people in the North, were simply growing more and more fanatical about the issue of slavery, that it was not just about economics anymore, that they're now using religion to defend a political point, that is to say. So, of course, you're going to see hundreds of abolitionist societies spreading across the North. Again, New England, also in Pennsylvania, and also in New York. Again, there's going to be, particularly in the Northeast, we're going to see, again, the strongest presence of abolitionist societies. And not all the abolitionists were just simply writing letters to Congress and trying to, raise the awareness, the consciousness of the population on this issue, to convince people that this was wrong. We need to do away with it. This is barbaric. In other words, how can we call ourselves Christians when we're enslaving other people and so on? So the abolitionists, of course, were not just using rhetoric. They were not just using, again, the mechanisms of just simply trying to persuade others with arguments or sermons or writing letters. But some abolitionists, not all, but some abolitionists became extremely radical in their thinking. And they really believed that they were given a mission by God, to fight slavery. In other words, it was not just, enough to be persuading people and writing letters, but rather to become more and more active, more militant, in other words, in this cause. And they became highly radicalized. That is to say, we're going to see also the rise of the radical abolitionists again. People like John Brown, for example. Okay, he's going to be an abolitionist, coming from New York. He's going to, he claimed again that he actually heard the voice of God inside his head, telling him to liberate the slaves, even by the use of violence, in other words, to start a religious war, in other words, okay, against slave owners. And he's going to take a group of people. Along with him will come some of his sons and other friends, that were also radical abolitionists, deeply religious, by the way, who were convinced that they were on a mission, in other words, on a religious crusade, a religious war, to fight again, to liberate enslaved peoples again. So he's going to take a group of people to Kansas. In 1855, there was again already a kind of civil war taking place. The Civil War has not yet begun in the United States, but the settlers of Kansas are fighting each other over the issue of slavery. So John Brown is going to participate in that little civil war in the territory of Kansas. This is Kansas territory, where people were trying to decide whether Kansas will be free or slave, etc. So settlers were fighting. And he's going to go there and participate. He's going to be there and actually, conduct a series of murders. He's going to be murdering a lot of people, some people that were known to be slave owners or defending the cause of slavery, even just ordinary people, in other words, that were not necessarily plantation owners, were also murdered by John Brown in a very gruesome way, by the way. So, this is Northerners already coming into hot spots of the country to participate in conflict. And of course, they believed that they were doing just God's bidding. In other words, this is what God wants us to do. So, of course, the South is going to be so horrified. Southern planters, Southern society will be totally horrified that abolitionism was really tearing the country apart, that this cause was a religious cause, endorsed by religious fanatics, really, that were using violence, they were using force, they were murdering people in the name of God, in other words. So again, the South is not willing to negotiate or compromise with that position because this is a very radical position, in other words. So again, the South is not going to go along with the abolitionist movement. It's going to reject it and is going to go against the abolitionists wherever they rise in their own states. In the South, like in Texas, for example, in 1860, we're going to see that there were certain incidents or troubles, again, the so-called Texas trouble, something, I covered in a previous topic. There were wildfires that were raging in places like Dallas and Fort Worth area, in forests, due to droughts. There were prolonged droughts, by the way, that made the landscape quite dry. In other words, it was just, again, it would require a match or a spark for everything to, catch in fire. There was wildfires. And the peoples of Texas believe that those were incidents related to the abolitionists. That maybe this is something that the abolitionists are doing, because they were already panicked, at what John Brown was doing in Kansas, for example. The abolitionists were becoming quite radical in their cause, their thinking. So there were fears of abolitionists being involved in Texas, trying to stage a slave insurrection, and that the wildfires were related to that, and so people were already paranoid, in other words. And again, the abolitionists that were known in Texas were actually arrested. There were about 10 white abolitionists, and 30 slaves were actually apprehended, and they were tried and executed. Not necessarily because they were involved in an insurrection or any kind or anything like that. It's just that people were already in panic mode, that is to say, because of the abolitionist movement that was really reaching new heights in in terms of violence, for example. Using God as a way to attack other people or to kill people, etc. Again, this is how certain abolitionists were now behaving. So this is going to tear the country apart, by the way. The South is not going to hear the North anymore on the issue of slavery just because they felt that the North had gone crazy. In other words, this is just madness, in other words. So that's the second reason. Now, the third reason why we're going to see a civil war. The third reason that brought about the Civil War was also political divisions in the country. Political parties will divide the nation over the issue of slavery. Okay, so political parties, ever since the beginning of the Republic, going all the way to George Washington, the first president. Well, political parties didn't really necessarily exist during George Washington's first administration, but they now come into being in his second administration, okay, in his second term. And George Washington was very, very cautious. He was not very happy with the rise of political parties in the United States. As a matter of fact, when he left office, his farewell address, he left an address to the nation, warning future presidents, warning the future generations of Americans that political parties will one day divide the country. That you might think that this is, a necessary thing, to, join a group that has certain ideas, a certain way of thinking about the country. They want to move the country in a certain direction because you believe this is the best possible future for the nation. Says it's all fine. That's what political parties represent. But in the end, this can also lead to divisions within the country. Families can become divided. Cities can become divided. States and the whole country can be torn apart just because some people join one party and the others, another. And when those parties oppose each other, inevitably people will oppose each other. Of course, they will oppose each other. And in the end, they will actually be fighting each other. In other words, okay. So again, political parties, of course, there's some benefits, to it, but there's also a downside. In other words. Okay, it can actually tear the country apart. When the two parties become so opposed to one another, that is to say, when they're so opposed to one another, when they endorse totally different visions of the future, that can actually lead to a social rupture, that is to say, in the country. So that's exactly what's going to happen, again, in the United States by 1860. That's exactly, again, it's just turned to be prophetic in a certain sense. Not that George Washington was a prophet or anything like that. It's just that his prediction just happened to come to fruition by 1860. So how is the country going to become divided politically? Okay, how are political parties going to divide Americans? In other words, and they're going to divide Americans geographically as well. What I mean is that what we're going to see is that the South, by the 1840s, is going to endorse one particular party, and that is the Democratic Party. Southerners believe that they require political representation in every institution of government. They require politicians to represent the interests, the views of the South, whether we're talking about Congress, the Senate, the House, or they're talking about the Supreme Court, or they're talking about the presidency as well. They need Southerners, in other words, in office to represent the interests of the South. And of course, what we're talking about here Southern interest is slavery. In other words, we need people that are going to protect this institution. Okay, so the way to do it is by endorsing one main party, that is going to represent the views of the South. And that's exactly what happened by the 1840s, particularly after Texas was annexed into the Union in 1845. The annexation of Texas into the Union, Texas comes into the Union as a slave state. Okay, it's a slave state. That annexation itself actually divided the country. There was an uproar in American society because many people viewed that the annexation of Texas was largely due to the influence of Southern planters that had grown so wealthy because of their cotton economy, the king cotton, that they used their wealth, this enormous fortunes that they built with the growth of cotton and the exports of cotton through the use of slave labor to lobby members of Congress, in other words, to pay money, if you will, to members of Congress to convince them that this was the best course of action. We needed to annex Texas as a slave state. And that's, as a result, Texas was simply expanding everywhere, in the country. It was expanding. It was not contracting. It was not ending, but rather it was expanding. So when Texas was annexed, this is the time when Southerners are going to now endorse the Democratic Party and says, we need, a political party that is going to be the Southern Party. And so from that point, more and more Southerners began to endorse the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party from 1845 onwards is now going to become associated with slavery. Okay, so this is going to be the party that defends slavery and protects slavery, because this is the party that is heavily funded by Southern planters. So most of the people that are nominated for office under the Democratic Party are people that defend slavery. In other words, this is the party of the South. And why is it that Southerners decide that this is the party to represent, the views, the values, the interests of the South? Is because the Democratic Party was representing the ideals of democracy back in the 19th century. Okay, the ideals of democracy, the principles of democracy were simply known as life, liberty, and property. This is what the party represented, that individuals have certain rights. Again, it's called, natural rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property. So what was so appealing about that, for Southern planters is that this was, a very good philosophy to defend the rights of the states, not just the rights of individuals, but also states. The states are just like individuals. States also have the right to life, liberty, and property. And since slaves are property, therefore, no one can take this right from us, because that would be a violation of a democratic, principle. You're violating my right to property, that is to say. So I'm gonna vote Democrat, because Democrat, again, this party is going to protect the rights of the states. It's called states' rights. The states have the right to life, liberty, and property, but here, what Southern planters are more interested, about is actually property. In other words, slavery is property. That is to say, okay, slavery is property. So therefore, the Democratic Party is going to be now the party of the South. And so what's going to happen is that people that voted Democrat, okay, in the North, there were many Northerners that voted Democrat, prior to this time, they're going to find that the Democratic Party doesn't represent the interests of the North. The Democratic Party is now the party of the South, that is to say. So also the North is also going to give rise to a series of parties as well. We're going to see also in the North the flourishing of certain parties that are going to represent the interests, particularly of Northern states. Okay, so there's going to be a series of different parties, like the Whig Party, for example. The Whig Party was the party of manufacturers, the industrialists. Again, the Whigs, they were called manufacturers in the Northeast. The Free Soil Party was the party of farmers that wanted a free soil in the Western territories. They don't want slavery to move in the West because they want to own lands for farming. They want a free soil for farming, in other words, not for planters, again, but for farmers. And the Liberty Party was simply the party of the middle class, again, in the North. You know, the middle class believes that slavery was threatening liberty. The expansion of slavery was simply threatening the idea of liberty itself, because if slavery was allowed to expand everywhere, therefore, the enslavement of human beings of certain ethnic or racial background, they said, will lead to the enslavement of all. In other words, we're going to be a nation of slaves. So this is a party of the middle class. They all believe that what was really important is that slavery needs to go. Whether you were from the Whig Party, Free Soil, or the Liberty Party, despite the fact that those are different sectors, again, social groups, there's different sectors of society, they all agree on one thing, again, that slavery needs to be abolished. Again, so those are abolitionist parties. They're abolitionist parties, by the way, that their strongest presence is in the North, despite the fact that there are people, of course, that follow the Whigs and so on, you know, the Free Soil in the South. There are people that don't agree with slavery, by the way, in the South, and they might be sympathetic to the Whig or Free Soil or the Liberty Party, by the way. In Texas, for example, in the urban centers, let's say Houston, okay, Galveston, you know, San Antonio, for example, Dallas, particularly, in those urban centers, the Whigs had a strong presence there, okay? The manufacturers, even though, of course, Texas is not a manufacturing state, there are very small scale type of industries, if you will, very small. Again, this is not comparable by any means to the industries of the Northeast of the United States. So, but nonetheless, in Texas, there are people that are sympathetic towards the Whig cause. Again, they're considered the Whigs. In Texas also, there are Democrats that do not agree with slavery. Okay, there are Democrats that are called the Unionists. In other words, look, we don't want to separate from the Union. Okay, we are Democrats that feel that we should stay together, that the nation should stay united, in other words, because the other half of the Democrats in Texas were people that were separatists. They wanted secession. They did not want to do anything with the North. They were called the fire eaters. There was another branch of the Democrats called the fire eaters, that they want immediate separation from the United States, because again, they said there's no compromise. We're not going to negotiate with the North. The North wants to abolish slavery. We want to keep it. So they were called the fire eaters because they were so vocal. They were so passionate, again, in their cause, in their arguments, that, again, they just simply did not want, of course, any negotiations. There's another party, the Know Nothing Party, as well, that are also in favor of the Union. They're not necessarily in favor of slavery as well. They don't agree necessarily with the fire eaters as well. So not all the peoples of Texas think the same. They're not in the same political camp, by the way. The Democratic Party is the dominant party, that's for sure, again, in the South. But there are sectors of the population that do not agree with slavery. They do not agree with separation from the Union. They want compromise. They want unity. Okay, they want national unity. In other words, they want to remain in the Union. They are in favor of industry, for example, like the Whigs, again, of Texas. They want, again, industrialization. So not all, again, peoples in the South think the same. This is not a monolith. In other words, not all the South is just simply the same mentality. They're all going along with the same party politics. But what is becoming clear is that the Democratic Party is becoming the dominant party of most of the southern states. They're the ones holding office. They're the ones controlling legislation, policy making, you name it. Again, they're the ones trying to create a unified bloc in the South, despite the fact that there's disagreement, of course. There's, minor parties within those states that do not agree with the main, line. But once again, what we see is that political parties are beginning to divide society. In other words, we're going to see abolitionist parties in the North, like the Whigs, the Free Soil, the Liberty Party, and some people in the South are pretty much moving in those directions as well. But the Democratic Party is pretty much splitting the country in half geographically, because this is becoming more and more the party of the South. Now, of course, those political divisions are going to intensify when the war with Mexico comes to an end. Okay? Because just as Texas was an issue, the annexation of Texas into the Union divided American society over the issue of slavery. Many Americans, particularly in the North, felt that slavery was expanding, everywhere. It expanded in Texas, they said. And now that we see the war with Mexico coming to an end in 1848, we're going to see the Mexican Cession, this large territory that Mexico lost to the United States, from New Mexico all the way to California, the American Southwest, as it's called. So now Americans are growing more and more concerned about the issue of slavery in the Mexican Cession. Is slavery going to expand in California? Is it going to expand in New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and the like? Is slavery going to be moving there? From the perspective of the South, of course, they said, of course, yes, there's no limitation, there's no constriction. Slavery will simply be moving, expanding across the Mexican Cession. Okay? They believe that was their right to do so, of course. But in 1850, California applied for statehood, the territory of California, which is part of the Mexican Cession, by the way. It applies for statehood to the Union as a free state. The settlers of California want a free soil. They want a free state. They want a constitution that does not allow for slavery to exist in that state. So when California sent the letter, the petition to Washington, this really exploded again into a debate and actually a physical fight in the halls of Congress. Congressmen were already fighting. There were fist fights. There were duels. Northern congressmen against Southern congressmen. They were all fighting over the issue of slavery because Texas sent a petition to join the Union, but as a free state. And of course, Northerners were jubilant. They said, yes, of course, this is great. We're going to join a new state. We're going to welcome a new state that is free and not slave. And Southerners were simply enraged about it. And of course, this fight, physical fight, by the way, in the halls of Congress by 1850. So what was needed was really a compromise to decide, how the territories were going to be organized. Because this is going to continue the fight. In other words, the fight, between Northerners and Southerners will simply continue to divide people, to divide Americans. And so there was a compromise called the Compromise of 1850. Okay, the Compromise of 1850. So what was the Compromise of 1850? The compromise is that, look, since congressmen cannot decide over the fate of slavery in the Western territories, therefore, the issue of slavery will be decided by the settlers of the territories. So if Americans move into the Western territories and they want to apply for statehood, they organize a territory and they pretty much want to become a state, that those settlers will have to decide, they will have to hold an election for them to decide whether they want to live in a free state or a slave state. This is called popular sovereignty. Let the people decide. Let the people rule, again, in those particular territories, whether they want to live in a free or slave state. Okay, it's called popular sovereignty. And so, again, this was the Great Compromise of 1850 to pretty much ease the tensions in the country. Texas, under the compromise, by the way, of 1850, also, there were some arrangements, again, in which Texas had to give up their claims of New Mexico. There were large tracts of land that Texas claimed into New Mexico itself, by the way, that the settlers of New Mexico were contesting about. They just don't want to be part of Texas. That territory, they want to separate it from Texas to be part of New Mexico territory. And of course, the Great Compromise of 1850 actually paid Texas $10 million to give up their claims of New Mexico. And this was greatly welcomed, by the way, because Texas was in a very dire financial situation. It had a public debt that needed to pay, and that money came in, at the very right time. This is great. In other words, we're just going to actually move forward with this compromise and, of course, accept it. Of course, the issue was not really settled there. We're going to see, of course, how the country is going to become increasingly divided by 1854, when suddenly people are moving into Kansas, the territory of Kansas, and they needed to pretty much separate Kansas from the rest of the territory of Nebraska. Nebraska was a gigantic territory in the upper portions, again, of the Louisiana territory. And they detached, a portion of the Nebraska territory to create the territory of Kansas, called the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And there were already 50,000, 60,000 settlers there that wanted to be now part of the Union. So they, invoked popular sovereignty. Let's hold an election, okay? And they held an election to decide whether they wanted to be free or slave. And this election turned into a mess. Suddenly there's going to be a lot of newcomers during election day. People from Missouri, the slave state of Missouri, are going to cross the line into Kansas territory to cast votes. Thousands and thousands of votes that were not from Kansas residents to tilt the scale in favor of slavery. And nobody recognized the results, again, in the election of 1855. And nobody recognized the result because both parties claimed that they won the election. And there's already a civil war, okay, breaking out in Kansas. Again, there's people fighting each other over slavery in the Kansas territory. So this really convinced Northerners, this incident, the Kansas incident, that it was totally necessary now to create a political party to represent the views, the interests of the North. So this is, again, giving rise to the Republican Party. Okay, the rise of the Republican Party. People in the North now create a widespread national political organization to embrace all the abolitionists. All the minor parties are going to be absorbed. The Whig Party, the Free Soil Party, the Liberty Party, even Northern Democrats in many cases are going to now fall under the umbrella of this new party called the Republican Party. And that is created to represent the views of the North. And the views of the North they're all based on ending slavery. Again, the party platform of the Republican Party is, we need to abolish slavery because, number one, slavery is immoral. Okay, it's not moral whatsoever. This is a sin. We all agree this is a moral wrong. It's unjust, it's barbaric, and the like. So first and foremost, again, this is what we all believe, despite the fact that we come from many different backgrounds in the North. We all agree on that. And we're going to work to prohibit the expansion of slavery into all the Western territories. The Republican Party is going to work toward that end and also force the ultimate extinction of slavery in the Constitution. So again, the Republican Party is now really bringing Northerners together to represent the opposing viewpoint of the South. So in the South, we have a Democratic Party, okay, that represents slavery, the perpetuation, the preservation of this institution. In the North, we see a different political party, the Republican Party, that represents exactly the opposite. It represents, of course, the end of slavery, period. So this is going to split the country in half once again, you know. So therefore, political divisions, you know, as I mentioned, this is extremely important, again, that the country is becoming increasingly divided over the issue of slavery. Okay, now there's two main parties representing the two regions of the country, you know, the Republican North against Democratic South, and they're really moving in opposite directions now, you know, totally 180 degrees. I mean, there's no compromise. One wants to end slavery and the other one wants to perpetuate it. So there's no room, there's no middle ground, in other words. So obviously, this is going to divide Americans, of course, as a result of that. Okay, Americans will become increasingly divided politically, because if you're a Republican, then you oppose the views of the Democrats and back and forth, in other words. So, from the perspective of the South, Southerners view the Republican Party not as an ordinary party. Okay, they view the Republican Party as a revolutionary organization. In other words, what they want is a revolution. So this is no ordinary party. They're trying to change drastically, rapidly, and radically the way of life of the South. They want to end the traditions, the culture of the South, based on agriculture, based on plantations, based on a master-slave relationship. In other words, that this is totally unnatural. This is not the natural state of affairs for us. We don't see that this is the natural order of society. Now, the natural order of society has been that there's a master-slave relationship, again, that exists, masters and slaves. You know, we talked about that in the very beginning of this topic. Okay, it's feudal society. It's a feudal society, and we have lords in this case and servants again at the bottom. This is the order again in which the landlords, the planters, the masters, if you will, are of course the dominant ones. You know, it's called white supremacy again in the South. This is just simply supremacy. So there's no, in other words, the idea of social equality is not part of the Southern social structure, is not part of the social norm. Okay, it's not even part of the culture itself. And so what Southerners believed is that the Republican Party was trying to stage a revolution in the South to alter that order, in other words. And in the same in the process, at the same time, do away with slavery, which was at the same time a violation of property rights. Okay, so again, this is a package. In other words, it's not just the abolition of slavery. It's not that simple. In other words, for Southerners, that the Republican Party simply wants to abolish slavery. That's a simple change that can just happen and move forward, because by removing that institution, by ending that institution, the entire society will have to change as a result of that. Social relations, the relationship between people, between the people that own the land, own the enterprises, and the workforce will have to alter, will have to change at the same time. Okay, so this will change dramatically, the entire social organization, the existence itself of Southern society. Okay, so this the rise of the Republican Party, okay, is going to really lead to a secessionist movement, okay, in the South. The Democrats, the fire eaters, they're going to now more than ever talk about secession, that this is the only way out. Again, because now we are dealing with a new party that represents the North, And if they ever win the presidency, if they ever control Congress or the Senate, etc., this is going to be the end. This is going to be the end of the Southern way of life, in other words. So again, they grow in numbers, particularly also they grow in numbers in Texas as well. All right, so the final factor that brought the Civil War was actually the presidential election of 1860. In the presidential election, we're going to see the rupture again of the Union. Again, the Republican Party that represented the North nominated Abraham Lincoln in 1860 to run for president of the United States for the Republican Party. He was one of the most prominent abolitionists in the country. From Illinois, he was known for his abolitionist speeches. He was actually, going back to the 1830s and 1840s, involved in the Second Great Awakening to a certain extent. He was deeply religious. He was not necessarily a member of a church, and he was, involved in the revival directly, but he was influenced by that generation. That's what I meant. He was influenced by the generation of the Second Great Awakening. He was influenced by that religious revival. And also he had a Quaker background as well. Okay, even though he was not raised in Pennsylvania, he's from Illinois. He grew up with families that had a Quaker influence. Okay, and the religion that rejected slavery. Again, this is the first religion that rejected slavery and that abolished slavery very early on in Pennsylvania colony, abolished the slave trade. They had strong views against slavery, by the way, considering that sin, etc. So again, because he was heavily influenced by this Quaker upbringing, that is going to shape his views about that institution, and he's going to pretty much outright reject it. Of course, in many of the speeches, the abolitionist speeches that he was providing across the North, he was very well known for. Of course, he rejected and criticized the institution. Now, the Democratic Party represents the South, and they nominated Stephen Douglas, who's a pro-slavery Democrat, by the way, who ran on a campaign of popular sovereignty. In other words, look, let the people decide. I'm not here to tell you that slavery is okay and that I'm going to defend it, but rather, I think the people should decide. In other words, he was passive about it, but he was consenting, that it was right that slavery should exist, because if people want slavery, then therefore you have to respect the will of the people, in other words. So it was a very passive way of saying, I'm for slavery, that is to say. So this presidential election was totally sectional. In other words, the North voted one way and the South voted another way. The Northerners voted Republican and the South voted Democrat. Again, it was totally sharply divided along geographical lines, this election. The South, of course, threatened with secession even before the election. They even erased the name Lincoln on the ballot in the South. There's no way you can vote for Lincoln in the South. They erased it. But even then, even if they erased the name of Lincoln, they lost the war because the North carried more weight electorally speaking. There's more people living in the North, more electoral vote. So Lincoln won the presidential elections of 1860. And of course, that led to the secession crisis. Okay, the secession. The South is going to secede, starting with South Carolina, bringing along Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Okay, and they said, we're not going to be part of the Union anymore because Lincoln won the election. the Republicans are about to initiate a cascade of legislation to end slavery. And the only way to preserve slavery is if we're not part of the country. So we're going to separate and we're going to actually create our own, block here, the Southern bloc, if you will, an alliance of states called the Confederacy. A confederacy is just an alliance. That's what it is. An alliance of independent states, that is to say. Okay. So they seceded from the Union. And of course, now Texas will have to make a decision whether to move towards secession or not. Is Texas going to secede as well? Is Texas going to join the Confederacy? In other words, of course, slavery is, the dominant labor system of the state, and cotton agriculture, plantation systems are the most productive, the most profitable of the state, the most profitable enterprise. So, of course, Texas wants to maintain slavery, but again, not everybody. There are groups within Texas that don't want to secede, okay? There are members of certain political parties that don't want to secede, or there's simply some people that live in Texas that they want to remain part of the Union. Even the governor, Sam Houston, who's governor, again, of the state, don't want to secede. He is actually, again, the governor, and he wants to maintain the Union, again. But there's a strong pro-slavery, again, element, pro-slavery bloc, again, the fire eaters, the Democrats, the secessionists that simply want to join the Confederacy. They want to secede. And of course, they're going to present a list of complaints and grievances, again, that they are issuing, to back up their secessionist, ideas, the secessionist claims. And that is that they want to secede, so they said, because Texas was totally unprotected from the Comanches. In other words, look, we don't want to be part of the Union because the Union never really protected us from, the Comanches. In other words, the hostilities. Also, there's been plenty of border conflict with Mexico, again, on the border that remained ever since really Santa Anna left Texas back in 1836. All the way to this time that Mexico continued to be hostile again in the border region. They also use that as an excuse as well. There's also the Cortina War as well. Again, this is a Mexican cattle rancher that was waging war against the Texas Rangers, also in the Rio Grande Valley. Again, crossing to the Mexican side, finding refuge in Mexico and then crossing back into Texas, stealing cattle, and so on and so forth. And Texas was unable to deal with Cortina. And they felt that, the Cortina War is going on and we haven't yet put down this rebellion by Cortina. So we are not really helped. We have no assistance, in other words. There's religious violence as well, okay? They use the idea of the abolitionists, the Texas troubles at the same time. And of course, the idea that, the North was totally fanatical, about, abolitionism, that they were religious fanatics. They were so violent. And also because that the North opposed slavery. In other words, you're opposing outright, very vocally, very openly, the institution of slavery, something that is so intrinsic in our society, so essential in our economy. So you're openly rejecting slavery and you're promoting the idea of racial equality, in other words, something that is totally contrary to the structure, to the traditions, to the values of Texas society. And again, this is totally alien. This idea of racial equality is totally alien in the South, once again, because of the social organization of master-slave relation, etc., that existed. So, of course, Sam Houston, the governor, is not willing to sign any treaty or paper or declaration for secession, and instead, what he wants is for the public to decide. In other words, if the politicians decide, that the state Congress is pushing for secession, what they want is for the congressmen to consult the people, that there should be a vote, a public, election for people to decide whether they want to continue with the Union or secede, in other words. Of course, there were sectors of the country that were so in favor. The eastern side of Texas and the southeast was so in favor of secession, by the way, okay, because they were more connected to the old South. They were connected to Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and the like. I mean, those groups, again, this is where the strongest presence of slavery, okay, you're going to find plantations, etc. And so they were more connected to the King Cotton, again, of the Deep South, if you will. So they were in favor. But the people of the North, again, North Texas and West Texas, were totally against. You know, those peoples came from Ohio. Again, many of them were actually German immigrants, cattle ranchers. That depended on the trade that with the United States, you know, providing foodstuffs to the soldiers, for example, or receiving grain from northern farmers, etc. So they were totally against, but nonetheless, it was an overwhelming support for secession. So January 17, 1861, Texas formally secedes from the Union. Okay, so the Civil War then begins. The Civil War then begins, and Texas, we're now just going to look at Texas, particularly and primarily Texas. So let's look at Texas in the Civil War. This is the second part. So we looked at the causes quite extensively of the Civil War. Now let's look at Texas in the Civil War. From the perspective of Texas, there was some level of enthusiasm by the participants, those that are going to engage in the fighting against the Union. Of course, the Union is, again, the North. Lincoln, in other words, Abraham Lincoln is now moving forces towards the South, and the war begins by 1861. And we're going to see the Union forces coming into the southern states, and the southern states will have to defend their own borders, defend their own territories from the Union forces. Likewise with Texas as well. Okay, so from the perspective of Texas, there was a high level of enthusiasm that this was the second war of independence. In other words, look, we already went through this. Okay, the first time we went through this was back in 1836 when Texas fought Mexico. Okay, we fought the forces of Santa Anna. We were invaded by Santa Anna in 1836, and we all, at some point, got together. You know, there was some organization, again, in which there were several divisions that were now organized to repel Santa Anna, and we did. Okay, we finally defeated Santa Anna, and he signed the Treaty of Velasco granting the independence of Texas. And likewise, they said this is the second war of independence. So many people were bringing back those memories that this was, you know, another glorious moment again in the history of Texas. Okay, and again, this really stirred, if you will, the emotions, the nostalgia that people felt about independence, and that this was going to be remembered for many, many generations to come. This is going to be an epic battle for freedom, etc. They said, you know, to be free from tyranny and the like. Again, there were pronouncements, you know, along those lines. So that, again, this is in the very initial stages, by the way, of this war, the Civil War. However, there's going to be, of course, certain issues that will inevitably take place that we'll have to see, of course, within Texas during the Civil War that are going to become significant for the outcome, again, of the war. And that is, for example, number one, the abandonment of federal forts. You know, the United States, when Texas joined the Union, built a series of forts. We talked about that, again, in an earlier topic, in the previous topic. Again, a series of forts to protect the peoples of Texas from the Comanches, for example, the Native Americans who were hostile to Texas. Something that, you know, had existed really going back to the Spanish colonists. Of course, when the Spanish colonized Texas, they were also facing the fierce raids and attacks of the Comanches. So when the federal forts were abandoned, federal forces left those forts because now Texas is no longer part of the Union. So this really opened the door again for reigniting a Comanche war. Now that the federal forces are no longer there, so the Comanches felt that this was a great opportunity to start to reignite their campaigns against Texas. In other words, and this is going to be a very fierce battle. The Comanches are going to raid more intensively the settlements, the cattle ranchers, etc. Their property will be totally devastated, destroyed, because they were now unprotected. Okay, totally unprotected. And all of the western settlements, all of the settlements that had reached all the way to the western part of Texas, retreated to the original line going back to the east part of Texas, because West Texas was totally in control of the Comanches. There's no protection, in other words. So that was the downside of seceding from the Union, is that you will no longer have the protection of the United States, in other words. And of course, there's going to be also warfare with the Kickapoo tribes of West Texas, present day, the area of San Angelo, Texas. We're going to see also, again, a series of conflicts and confrontations with the Kickapoo tribes, the Kickapoo warfare as well. So there's now Indian warfare, in other words, on the rise. So besides Texas being fighting the Union forces, it's also fighting the Indians in the frontier, particularly in the western part of the state. So this was the inevitable consequence, again, of seceding from the Union. And of course, the end result was that there will be catastrophic, of course, consequences in terms of the loss of lives on both sides, the loss of property. Cattle will be stolen and raided and plundered. A lot of Texas ranchers lost their cattle, for example, to the Comanches, but also the Indian population declined sharply as a result of those conflicts, and a 40% decline of the population of the indigenous peoples of West Texas as well. Also, the abandonment of the federal forts led to overall anarchy and lawlessness as well. Okay, because those forts served as a bulwark, if you will, against bandits, against robbers, against, people that were thieves, for example, that were stealing property or animals or etc. But now, since they're totally unprotected, Texas is totally unprotected, now we're going to see anarchy and lawlessness, again, plunder, violence, and banditry. So it was so difficult to identify the source of who actually stole the cattle, or who plundered a cattle ranch, for example. Was it a Comanche? Was it just people that were taking advantage, that the federal forts were abandoned? So who did it? Nobody knew. So it was a state of anarchy and confusion, again, in the state, by the way. So again, this is the situation, again, that we find in Texas. Number two, the other aspect of the Texas in the Civil War is that during the Civil War, Texas made a trading partnership or alliance, if you will, with France, due to the fact that France colonized Mexico. Okay, so Mexico had become part of the French Empire, okay, in the late 50s and throughout a great portion of the 1860s. France was actually invaded in 1861, okay? Finally, there were French forces that finally took hold, of Mexico and turned Mexico into a French colony and installed an emperor, again, to rule Mexico, the Emperor of Mexico, Maximilian of Habsburg. The French installed Maximilian, again, as the Emperor of Mexico. This came as a result of a civil war. I mentioned Mexico is in the midst of a civil war. In the 1850s, there was a civil war between liberals and conservatives. What was the civil war about? Church land holdings. Okay, the liberals want to privatize all of the land of the Church of Mexico, and they want to sell it on the market to create producers, investors, merchants, enterprises, and the like. Capitalism, in other words. And so, since the church was very, very powerful, again, the church instead responded by inviting the French. Okay, the Catholic Church actually invited. The Catholic Church was part of the conservative sector of Mexican society. They were the conservatives. They invited France, the French ruler, to invade Mexico, to colonize Mexico, to save the lands of the church, in other words. So that was the only reason. So there's a civil war going on in Mexico that finally, by 1861, the French intervened in the civil war. They take hold of Mexico and installed, of course, an emperor to rule Mexico on behalf of the conservatives, on behalf of the church, on behalf of the land owners, the large landowners in Mexico City. So while the French control Mexico, they're going to supply materials to the Confederacy. Again, France was aiding the Confederacy as a whole, not just Texas, but the entire Confederacy, by the way. Okay. And Texas is going to also be part of this alliance. Texas is going to trade materials with the French through the port of Matamoros, again, in the Brownsville region, again, of Southeast Texas, and also the island of Baghdad. This is the southern portion of what is called South Padre Island, again, Baghdad, the island of Baghdad. Those were major contact points, if you will, between Texas and the French from Mexico, in which Texas provided cotton to the French. The French were in great need of cotton, and in return, the French will supply war materials to the Confederacy in Texas, munitions and muskets and gunpowder and the like, again, munitions, if you will. Okay, so France was actually aiding the Confederate cause, if you will, because it was in Mexico, by the way, during this time, because Mexico was in the midst of a civil war as well. So Texas is caught in the middle of two civil wars, is participating actively in the U.S. Civil War, and is also indirectly receiving, of course, some supplies from the French lines in Mexico that are also intervening in the Mexican Civil War as well. Okay, so that's very important because Texas received plenty of aid during this time, again, from France. Now, number three. Now, in terms of the battles, we're not really going to cover, again, strategies and battles and how many people were marching here and there. Not that it's not important, but this is not the emphasis, again, of this course. So the only thing to mention is that there were some initial victories in the first opening stages of the Civil War. Texas scored some major victories, particularly in key areas of the state from which trade was so vital. If Texas was to receive munitions or food, etc., from the outside, there were certain entry points that needed to be totally protected. For example, Brownsville, I mentioned. Brownsville and Brazos Island. This is the region that we know today as South Padre Island region. Again, in the Brownsville area of Southeast Texas, Texas actually secured for quite a while, again, this region, because this is from which Texas was receiving the supplies from Mexico. It was receiving goods, it was receiving cattle, it was receiving munitions and the like, again, that were vital to the Confederacy. And of course, exports as well of cotton. Cotton that was grown in the Houston area was now transferred to Brownsville, and it was exported to Great Britain and France. through the port of Matamoros, if you will, using Matamoros, the part of Mexico, again, for this export, if you will. And of course, importing war supplies, as I indicated, that were so vital. They also scored some major victories in the Galveston, Houston area. This was an international port in the Gulf of Mexico, also major for welcoming also resources, vital resources, particularly from France. And Texas also wanted to export cotton as well to Great Britain. This was also something that was secured for at least a few years. And again, Confederate forces in Texas were so adamant in holding on to that port as well. And of course, the trade with New Mexico as well. There's going to be campaigns. Texas is going to send troops to New Mexico to secure also the trade route, the Santa Fe Trail, for example, the supplies of New Mexico territory, the cattle ranches, etc., that were to be vital also for the Texas cause. For a moment, again, they were holding on the tide again of the war by retaining control of those particular points, and most of the battles will be fought there, by the way. Again, the battle between the Union and the Texas Confederacy were fought particularly in those three areas, by the way. Now, the Texas war effort crumbled nonetheless. Okay. At some point after 1863, moving into 1864, we're going to see the Texas war effort crumbling and disintegrating quite rapidly. It was already in a sharp decline because there were high-level desertions. That is to say, the people that joined the Confederacy in Texas to fight on the side of Texas, they lacked, in many cases, the enthusiasm, in other words, to be fighting, let's say, for slavery. If you did not own any slaves, for example, okay, and you were told that this was a vital, war, we need to defend slavery because this is an institution that is going to sustain our economy. Well, if you're a planter, that might be the case, but if you're a farmer, you're not going to feel that enthusiastic about that. Okay, so in many cases, many people abandoned their ranks and left the war because they just saw no need for it. They saw no connection, no emotional connection to the cause overall. So there's high-level desertions. Okay, there's also, of course, across Texas, a widespread support for the Union. Yeah, so there's people that support, again, the Union, not the Confederacy, particularly when we look at, for example, northern settlers around the Dallas-Fort Worth area. There's all of the people there are very sympathetic towards the Union. They want to return to the Union. And there's Western cattle ranchers as well that are not in favor of slavery. They don't own any slaves. They're more commercial oriented, and they want to join the Union. There's also, again, Whigs, Unionist Democrats, know-nothings that also don't favor secession, don't favor slavery. They want to join the Union. And of course, this widespread support, of course, for the Union, that also the Texas Confederates are finding that it's very difficult to rally people to this cause, to really draw the support of the masses towards this cause, because people don't feel, again, that they're fighting for something that is connected to them, to their culture, to the way of life, to their economy. It's just that this is not part of us, in other words. Okay. And of course, financial stress as well, financial distress. The finances of Texas during the war were taking a heavy toll because now we're in wartime, of course. So there's more expenses, in other words. You need to feed the troops. You need to be self-sufficient when it comes to food production, to feed the populations, of course. And there's lack of food. If there was any food in Texas, an overabundance is because there were food being imported from the north, from the Ohio Valley. There were grain flowing into Texas. Now this grain is not flowing. All those supplies are cut off. In other words, there's hyperinflation. Texas was simply printing money in order to pay for its expenses, but people realized that this was just paper, had no value. So it really was a devalued currency again, leading to hyperinflation. Products were becoming far more expensive because the money was worthless. By the way, and of course that led to forced taxation. In other words, the Confederate government of Texas is now really seizing property by force, seizing cattle, seizing resources by force in order to pay for their expenses, in order to provide food. They will seize your cattle, for example, by force in order to provide meat to the troops and the like. So this created discontent. More and more, the people of Texas found that, their property rights were violated during wartime in order to actually endorse the war, in other words. Okay, so there is just one final thing to mention here, and then we're going to actually just conclude our discussion here of the second session. The last portion is the end of the Civil War. So rather quickly, the only thing to mention here about the end of the Civil War is that the Civil War comes to an end with a series of strategies that Lincoln implemented, okay, to defeat the Confederacy rather quickly, okay? And that is that on one hand, it actually blockaded most of the southern ports, okay? Lincoln wanted to restore the Union and defeat the Confederacy as quickly as possible by depriving the Confederacy from receiving any wealth, any funds from the outside. And most of those funds came from cotton exports. The ability to export cotton enabled the Confederacy to receive monies, of course, either from Great Britain or France in this case. So what Lincoln did is blockade all of the southern ports, a naval blockade, stationing, a series of ships all around the Confederacy in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Atlantic Ocean from Virginia all the way to Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico, all the way to Texas, to prevent the South from exporting, from shipping out any cotton, depriving them of, again, receiving any financial aid to finance the war effort. So by 1863, they're going to be totally deprived of that particular, again, resource. The Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln actually emancipated the slaves in 1863. It announced the Emancipation Proclamation saying, we hereby now free the slaves, and so the Union generals fighting in the South will have to free the slaves on the spot. In other words, he gave an order to the Union generals fighting in Texas, fighting in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, that everywhere you go, you have to free the slaves. Okay, so that is going to deprive, of course, the Southern Confederacy of a labor system that was responsible for sustaining the war effort. The Southern economy, the entire Southern economy, the backbone of the Southern economy was slavery. So because the slaves were growing food, again, for the Confederacy, they were mining coal, they were building the military garrisons and ports. So if you free the slaves, they're not going to have that labor. This is the last asset of the Confederacy, so we need to remove it. In other words, the destruction of the Southern infrastructure as well. We need to destroy whatever capacity, again, the South has for conducting war. So any enterprise, any mechanism, any system of transportation has to be destroyed. Okay, scorched earth policy. In other words, burn down the barns, the cotton warehouses, destroy their limited railroads, for example. Anything that the South can use to wage war has to be destroyed. In other words, so the two states that suffered the most from this was Georgia and South Carolina. Again, those were the most rebellious against states that led secession. So therefore, their infrastructure was destroyed. Again, their plantations, their barns, warehouses, railroads, and the like. Again, this is a massive destruction that are going to cripple, again, the ability of the Confederacy to continue fighting. There's no way you can transport goods There's no way you can build wealth because you don't have the cotton anymore. You cannot ship it out. So this really strangled, if you will, the Confederacy to the point that or in very, very, few years, by 1865, they're going to call quits. They're going to surrender again. This is the destruction, again, of the railroads, the warehouses, the barns by the Union forces in places like Georgia and Florida. And of course, this is going to shatter the morale of the Confederacy to even continue fighting. By 1865, General Grant and Sherman, the two generals that were involved in the shattering of Southern infrastructure, finally got to Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, occupied the capital, and the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders to General Grant there in Appomattox Courthouse, again on April 9, 1865, thereby ending, of course, the Civil War, of course. So this is the end, again, of the Civil War. When we come back, we're going to now move into Reconstruction, the process of Reconstruction, and how Texas is going to move towards this new episode, and how Texas will be rebuilt, how we're going to see the end of slavery in Texas, etc. Something we're going to cover actually in session 3 when we come back. That's all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session 3 to move into Reconstruction. Thank you.